Colonel James Edwards, a decorated U.S. Army officer whose life is turned upside down after a shocking encounter with law enforcement. Wrongfully detained despite his rank and service, James faces a moment that forces him to confront hard truths about justice in America. Determined to make change, he steps into the national spotlight, pushing for critical police reforms. But as his movement grows, so do the threats, both to him and his family. With the country watching, James must navigate powerful allies, relentless opponents, and personal sacrifices that test his courage at every turn. Will his commitment to justice bring lasting change? Or will the cost prove too high? If stories of courage and resilience inspire you, subscribe for more, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's dive into this gripping journey for justice. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue across the Virginia countryside as Colonel James Edwards made his way home from Washington, D.C. He drove in comfortable silence, appreciating the calm after a demanding day of meetings and briefings. Being a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army was not an easy job, and days like this, with hours of tense decision-making, often left him drained but proud. He had served his country faithfully for over 30 years, weathering the challenges that came with his uniform and, sometimes, with his skin color. His thoughts drifted to home, to the sanctuary he shared with his wife, Cynthia, and their two children, Grace and Ethan. As he neared the quiet suburbs of Arlington, he could almost imagine their warm voices greeting him, the scent of Cynthia's cooking wafting through the house, and the chatter of his children discussing their school day. These moments, though simple, reminded him why he chose this life of service. He wasn't just fighting for the country. He was building a world in which his children could live freely, without fear or prejudice. As he turned onto a quieter road, a police cruiser pulled up behind him. He noticed the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror, and his pulse quickened slightly. Even though he knew he had done nothing wrong, years of experience taught him to remain cautious. The cruiser's lights flickered once before settling back to a dim, almost watchful glow. A few miles later, James pulled into a small gas station, deciding to top off his tank before reaching home. He parked next to the pump, taking a moment to exhale and collect his thoughts. The cruiser had continued down the road, yet something about the officer's lingering gaze lingered in James's mind. It was a feeling he was familiar with, a sense that he'd been profiled, that he was being watched more closely than others because of his appearance. He shook it off, determined not to let a momentary discomfort spoil his evening. As he filled the tank, he let his thoughts wander back to his family. He knew that Cynthia would already be setting the table, and the thought of her warm smile filled him with renewed energy. Grace, his 12-year-old daughter, was eager to share her latest science project, while Ethan, at 16, was growing more independent each day. They were his motivation and his hope. But as he replaced the gas pump nozzle, he caught sight of the cruiser again, this time parked a short distance away by the convenience store. The officer inside appeared to be watching him intently, his face barely visible behind a reflection on the windshield. James hesitated, a sense of discomfort settling over him. He quickly finished at the pump, paid inside, and returned to his car, glancing once more at the cruiser before pulling onto the road. Not long after leaving the gas station, James saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror again. This time, the cruiser was right behind him, signaling for him to pull over. Confused, he glanced at his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding, nor had he violated any traffic laws. Nevertheless, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. A moment passed, and then he saw the officer step out of his cruiser. The man, who looked young and carried a certain confidence in his stride, approached James's SUV. His hand hovered near his holstered gun, a sight that instantly set James on edge. As the officer reached his window, James took a calming breath before rolling it down. The officer's gaze was sharp, assessing, and James could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, his tone flat, but with an undertone that made James's skin prickle. "Of course, officer." James kept his voice calm, measured. He reached over to the glove compartment, retrieved his registration, and handed over his driver's license. The officer took the documents, his expression unreadable as he inspected them. After a moment, he looked up, his gaze hardening. "Step out of the vehicle, please." James felt a ripple of confusion. "Officer, could you explain why I'm being asked to step out?" The officer's face tightened. "Just do as I say, sir, or I'll have to make you comply." It took all of James's discipline to remain calm. Years of experience and countless situations had taught him to keep his composure, to not let anger cloud his judgment. "Officer, with respect, I'd like to know the reason for this request." "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, more forcefully this time. The tension in the air was almost palpable as James reached to unbuckle his seatbelt. As he stepped out of the SUV, he kept his movements slow and deliberate, hoping to avoid further escalation. He was a decorated officer, a man who had dedicated his life to serving this country, yet here he was being treated like a suspect. The officer, whose name badge read Randall, gestured for James to place his hands on the hood of the car. James complied, feeling the sting of humiliation simmering beneath his calm exterior. The officer's posture was rigid, his gaze cold and unsympathetic. "Do you know who I am?" James asked, his voice measured yet firm. The officer scoffed. "I don't care who you are. You're about to be under arrest for failing to comply with an officer's instructions." Before James could respond, Randall grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back with unnecessary force. He could feel the sharp bite of metal as the handcuffs snapped into place. The sting of the officer's treatment was both physical and deeply personal. As he was pressed against the hood, James felt a surge of anger. Anger not just at this officer, but at the years of quiet compliance, the countless times he had swallowed his pride to avoid conflict. But even now, he kept his emotions in check, knowing that any sign of resistance would only escalate the situation further. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. A dark sedan pulled up behind the police cruiser, and two men stepped out. The taller of the two, wearing an impeccably pressed uniform, approached with a calm but authoritative stride. "Lieutenant General Paul Jefferson, U.S. Army," the man announced, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the air. "Officer, I'd like to know what's going on here." Randall turned, his face draining of color as he registered the general's rank. He stammered, his confidence suddenly faltering. I didn't know." "Release him," General Jefferson commanded, his voice firm. With fumbling hands, Randall hurriedly unlocked the cuffs, avoiding James's gaze as he stepped back. The tension hung in the air, a mix of shame and silent fury. As James rubbed his wrists, he looked directly at the officer, his gaze unwavering. "I try to tell you," James said quietly, his voice steady. Randall looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Once the situation had been diffused, James climbed back into his SUV, feeling the lingering ache in his wrists and the deeper ache in his heart. The ride home was silent, his mind replaying the encounter. He had faced similar situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a casual glance or a suspicious look. This was an outright humiliation, a stripping away of his dignity, his authority, his very identity. When he arrived home, he was greeted by Cynthia's warm smile, but it faded as soon as she saw the tension in his eyes. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, guiding him to the kitchen table. "What happened?" she asked softly. James took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "I was detained, handcuffed, like a common criminal, by a young officer who saw me as a threat the moment he looked at me." Cynthia's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "James, how could they treat you like that?" He shook his head, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. "It's not the first time, Cynthia, but it's the first time in a long time that I felt it this deeply. Like no matter who I am or what I've accomplished, it still doesn't matter." Grace, who had overheard the conversation, approached, her young face full of concern. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked quietly. James forced a smile, reaching out to hug her. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." But as he held her close, he knew that something inside him had shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the world he wanted for his children, the future he wanted to shape. The next day, videos of the incident surfaced on social media, captured by bystanders who had witnessed the scene. The footage showed James being forced against his car, handcuffed, and treated with blatant disrespect despite his calm compliance. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Messages of support flooded his inbox from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a stark reminder of racial profiling in America. Headlines read, "Decorated Army Colonel Detained Without Cause." The incident sparked conversations across the country, igniting debates on social media and in households. James received a call from his longtime friend and attorney, Malcolm Harris, who was passionate about civil rights. "James, we need to take action. This is more than just one incident. This is a chance to bring real change." James listened, feeling a mixture of doubt and determination. He had always chosen the quieter path, the path of compliance. But this time, he felt a stirring inside him, a desire to stand up, not just for himself, but for the countless others who faced similar experiences every day. With Cynthia's encouragement and Malcolm's guidance, James decided to take a stand. He would not remain silent. This incident, humiliating as it was, would become the catalyst for change. In the days following the incident, the story continued to spread. Social media and news outlets kept the footage in the public eye, and James's inbox filled with messages, some supportive, others critical. At work, his colleagues and superiors treated him with a mix of sympathy and awkward avoidance, unsure of how to address what had happened. After a particularly exhausting day at the office, James sat in his study, going over the hundreds of messages he had received. He felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also a growing sense of responsibility. He could not ignore the fact that he'd become a symbol for something much larger than himself. That night, Cynthia joined him, bringing 2 cups of tea. "I think you should take this opportunity, James," she said gently. "This isn't just about you. It's about all the people who have faced similar situations but never had a voice." He took a sip of his tea, feeling the warmth seep into him. "I don't want our family dragged through this. It's already taken a toll on the kids." Cynthia placed a hand over his. "They're strong, and they look up to you. You have a chance to make things better, not just for us, but for so many families out there." After a long moment of silence, he nodded. "You're right. I can't just let this go." The next morning, James called his attorney, Malcolm Harris, and set up a meeting. Together, they decided to pursue a formal complaint and consider further legal action. The decision felt daunting, but James knew it was the right one. With Malcolm's guidance, James prepared a statement addressing the incident, which he would read at a press conference. The night before, he stayed up late, carefully choosing his words. He wanted to convey the seriousness of his experience without alienating those who might not fully understand the weight of racial profiling. The next day, he stood at a podium, cameras flashing and reporters murmuring. He took a deep breath, letting the silence settle over the room. "I have dedicated my life to serving this country, and I am proud to wear this uniform," he began, his voice steady. "But this incident is a reminder that even those who serve are not immune to injustice. This is not just about one encounter. It's about a pattern of bias that too many people face every day." As he continued, he noticed nods of agreement from some reporters. When he finished, the room burst into applause, and reporters began asking questions. James felt a surge of relief mixed with responsibility. He had taken the first step, and he knew there would be no turning back. The story went national, sparking a wave of support. Messages poured in from veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. Social media platforms were filled with hashtags like #JusticeForColonel Edwards and #EndRacialBias. James felt both humbled and energized, realizing the depth of the public support. As James became a public figure in the fight for justice, the attention took a toll on his family. Cynthia noticed the subtle changes in their daily lives. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact, and people in the community seemed divided in their opinions about James's actions. One evening, Grace came home visibly upset. She threw her backpack down and slumped onto the couch, crossing her arms in frustration. "What's wrong, honey?" Cynthia asked, sitting beside her. "Some kids at school were saying that Dad's making the police look bad," she mumbled, not meeting her mother's gaze. James, overhearing from the doorway, felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't wanted his children to bear the weight of his decisions. He walked over, sitting down beside Grace. "Sweetheart, I know this is hard to understand, but I'm doing this to make things safer for everyone, so that people are treated fairly, no matter who they are." Grace looked up at him, her young face filled with confusion and sadness. "But why can't people just understand? Why do they have to be so mean?" James hugged her tightly. "Sometimes, when we stand up for what's right, not everyone sees it the same way. But that doesn't mean we're wrong." Ethan, who had been listening from the stairs, joined them, sitting beside his sister. "Don't worry, Grace. I've got your back." James felt a swell of pride in his children's resilience. They were young, but they were already learning the importance of standing up for what was right. Meanwhile, Officer Mike Randall faced a suspension and an internal investigation after the incident. The consequences weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he began to question his own assumptions. Sitting alone in his apartment, he replayed the incident in his mind, recognizing how quickly he had assumed James was a threat without any real cause. His older brother, Eric, who had served as a firefighter for years, visited him one evening. Eric didn't mince words. "Mike, you've got to look in the mirror and ask yourself why you acted the way you did. This isn't about one mistake. It's about the way you see people." Randall sat quietly, absorbing his brother's words. He knew Eric was right, but admitting it felt like confronting a part of himself he had long ignored. After a restless night, he decided to attend a local community workshop on racial bias. It was a difficult choice, but he felt a growing need to understand the experiences of those he had too often seen as other. Listening to the stories of community members opened his eyes, and he felt a mix of shame and determination. For the first time, Randall began to see his actions as part of a larger problem. He resolved to learn from his mistakes, hoping that he could find a way to make amends. With public support growing, James and Malcolm decided to organize a coalition for police accountability. They reached out to Dr. Karen Monroe, a respected civil rights advocate, and together they began drafting proposals to present to local government leaders. Their initial meetings with community leaders were filled with passionate discussions and debates. The coalition worked tirelessly to draft policies that included mandatory bias training, body cameras, and independent oversight of law enforcement actions. At one of the meetings, James spoke with heartfelt conviction. "We need a system that ensures accountability and fosters trust. This isn't about vilifying officers. It's about creating a safe and just society for everyone." Dr. Monroe added, "These policies are about supporting good officers, too. The more we focus on accountability, the better we can serve our communities." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. James felt a surge of hope, knowing they were making progress, but he also understood that the journey would be long and arduous. As the coalition's work gained traction, the community became increasingly divided. Some people rallied behind James, seeing his efforts as a necessary step toward justice. Others, however, accused him of attacking the police, insisting that he was sowing division. Cynthia noticed the shift, particularly in their interactions with friends and neighbors. At the grocery store, she overheard two women talking about her husband, casting doubtful glances in her direction. "Isn't he just making things harder for everyone?" one of them muttered, glancing away when she noticed Cynthia nearby. Cynthia felt a sting of isolation, but she held her head high, determined not to let the criticism affect her. She knew that James was doing the right thing, even if some people couldn't see it. The division extended to James's colleagues, too. Some of his military peers expressed support, while others questioned his choice to go public. It was a reminder that change came with resistance, but James remained resolute. As tensions mounted, James received an unexpected call from Officer Randall, who asked to meet privately. After some consideration, James agreed, arranging to meet at a quiet coffee shop. When they sat down, Randall looked visibly uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. After a moment, he spoke, his voice thick with regret. "Colonel Edwards, I know what I did was wrong. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. I'm sorry." James studied him for a long moment, feeling a mix of emotions. He had every reason to dismiss Randall's apology, to hold on to the anger and humiliation. But he also recognized that Randall's willingness to admit his mistake was a step forward. "I appreciate your apology, Mike," he replied calmly. "But this isn't just about you and me. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Randall nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand that now. I'm committed to learning and changing. And if there's anything I can do to help, I'm here." They parted on a tentative note, their meeting marking the beginning of a possible reconciliation. For James, it was a reminder that change often started with difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. As the coalition continued to push for reform, James received anonymous threats warning him to abandon his mission. The messages grew increasingly menacing, and Cynthia found herself on edge, worried for their family's safety. One night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Tell your husband to back off, or you'll regret it." Cynthia's hands shook as she showed James the message. "James, this is getting dangerous. Maybe we need to rethink this." James wrapped his arms around her, feeling the weight of her fear. "I know it's scary, but this is what they want, to scare us into silence. I can't back down now, not when so many people are counting on us." He reached out to FBI agent Brian Collins, who had been monitoring potential threats. Collins assured them that they would increase security measures around their home, but he warned James that publicity often attracted resistance. "We'll handle the threats," Collins said. "But remember, they're trying to make you second-guess yourself. Stay focused." James nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. The threats only reinforced his commitment to pushing for change, no matter the cost. As the coalition's work gained national traction, so did the backlash. James became both a hero and a target, receiving messages from people he had never met. Many praised him, thanking him for his courage, while others accused him of being anti-police or divisive. One evening, exhausted from a full day of calls and meetings, he sat alone in his study, scrolling through the endless stream of messages. He tried to focus on the positive ones, but the negativity weighed heavily on him. Reading comments that twisted his mission into something hostile made him question his approach, even if just for a moment. He turned off his phone and leaned back, closing his eyes. Leading this movement was like carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. He thought about the impact his actions were having, especially on his family, and felt a pang of guilt. Just then, Cynthia entered the room, sensing his weariness. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, James. Remember, you have us." James gave her a tired smile. "I know, but sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Cynthia's gaze softened. "You're doing more than enough. You're standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's something to be proud of." Her words bolstered him, reminding him of why he'd started this journey in the first place. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift, if only slightly. As James continued his fight for reform, public support grew. Civil rights organizations, veterans groups, and everyday citizens rallied behind him, organizing marches and public gatherings in cities across the country. Social media became a platform for people to share their own experiences with discrimination, uniting voices in a powerful call for change. But the personal sacrifices became more evident as well. Grace's friends had grown distant, their parents warning them against getting too close to controversy. Ethan, usually quiet and steady, had become withdrawn, rarely mentioning school or his friends. One Saturday, James found Ethan alone in the garage, working silently on his bike. James took a seat next to him, watching him for a moment. "You've been quiet lately, Ethan. Is everything okay?" he asked gently. Ethan shrugged, not meeting his father's eyes. "It's just some people don't get what you're doing. They think you're making trouble." James's heart sank. He reached out, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know this is hard, but remember, doing the right thing isn't always easy. I'm doing this for you and Grace, for a future where people don't have to be afraid." Ethan nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "You get it? I just wish people could see what I see." They sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them unspoken but strong. James felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his children, even through the hardships, were proud of him. While James navigated the growing public and personal pressures, Officer Mike Randall continued his own journey of reflection and accountability. After his suspension, Randall began working with a community center focused on fostering positive relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. Initially, he attended the meetings as an observer, listening to stories shared by community members who had faced discrimination. These stories stirred something deep within him, an uncomfortable realization of his own prejudices and assumptions. One day, the community center director approached him. "Mike, would you be willing to share your story? People here know about the incident, but maybe hearing from you could make a difference." Randall hesitated, the weight of his mistakes feeling heavier than ever. But he agreed, knowing that if he truly wanted to change, he had to start with honesty. At the next session, he stood before a room of people, his voice shaky but sincere. "I made a mistake, a serious one, because I let my biases guide me instead of my training. I didn't listen or try to understand. I just assumed. And I'm sorry. I'm here to learn, and I want to do better." The response was a mix of skepticism and cautious acceptance. Randall felt the discomfort of their scrutiny, but he was determined to stay, to continue facing his mistakes head-on. Over time, his presence in the community center grew less contentious, and he began to form genuine connections with the people he once viewed with suspicion. His journey was slow, and not everyone forgave him, but he felt himself growing and changing in ways he hadn't thought possible. As James's efforts gained more attention, opposition forces launched a coordinated smear campaign. Anonymous sources began spreading rumors, questioning his military record and implying that his reform efforts were self-serving. Fabricated documents were circulated online, sowing seeds of doubt about his credibility. News outlets, eager for headlines, picked up the story, casting a shadow over James's mission. Headlines read, "Colonel's past under scrutiny, and is Edwards exploiting a national crisis?" The narrative was twisted, his intentions questioned by those who didn't know him. One evening, as James sat with Cynthia, the TV blared with commentators debating his character. The words cut deep, and he felt anger mixed with helplessness. "James, you know these are lies," Cynthia said, her hand on his arm. "People who know you, who know your work, won't believe this." James nodded, but the doubt lingered. He knew the power of perception, and he worried about the impact these rumors would have on his mission. Determined to fight back, James held a press conference the next day. Standing before the cameras, he spoke with calm conviction. "These accusations are false, an attempt to distract from the real issue. My service record is public, and I have dedicated my life to this country with honor. This campaign of misinformation is an attempt to undermine our efforts for justice, but we will not be deterred." His words struck a chord, and support poured in from veterans, public officials, and community leaders who attested to his integrity. The smear campaign did not vanish, but it weakened in the face of his truthfulness and resilience. Despite James's response, the community remained divided. Some neighbors avoided his family, while others quietly expressed their support. Cynthia noticed how quickly friendships had become strained, and it saddened her. One day, at the grocery store, she overheard a former friend talking about James with disdain. The woman didn't notice her nearby, and her words stung. "He's just making things harder for everyone. Why stir up all this trouble?" Cynthia held her head high, pretending not to hear, but the incident left her feeling isolated. She wondered if their lives would ever return to normal. That evening, she voiced her concerns to James. "I knew this wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect people to turn their backs on us." James took her hand, his expression pained. "I'm sorry, Cynthia. I never wanted you and the kids to bear this burden, but I believe we're making a difference." She looked into his eyes, seeing the determination there, and she found her own strength. "Then we'll stand by you no matter what." James received an unexpected message from Randall, who asked to meet privately to discuss something important. Although he hesitated, James agreed, hoping that it might offer some closure. They met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the media. Randall looked visibly nervous as he sat down, avoiding eye contact at first. After a moment, he spoke, his voice heavy with remorse. "Colonel Edwards, I'm here because I want to make things right. I know my actions were wrong, and I can't change what I did. But I've been working to understand, to learn from this." James listened, feeling a mixture of resentment and respect. "I appreciate your apology, Mike. But this isn't just about you or me. This is about creating change that prevents these situations from happening in the first place." Randall nodded, his gaze earnest. "I know. And if there's any way I can help, I want to." Their conversation ended on a hopeful but uneasy note. James knew that Randall's journey toward understanding was ongoing, but he appreciated the effort. It reminded him that even those who make mistakes could grow if given the chance. As the coalition's influence grew, the threats against James and his family escalated. Late one evening, Cynthia received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was cold, untraceable. "If your husband doesn't stop this crusade, there will be consequences. If your husband doesn't stop this crusade, there will be consequences." Cynthia's heart raced, and she quickly informed James, her face pale with fear. He held her, feeling the gravity of the situation sink in. They were no longer facing mere resistance. They were up against forces willing to harm them. James immediately contacted FBI agent Brian Collins, who assured them that security around their home would be increased. Collins warned that the attention had drawn dangerous elements, individuals intent on stopping James's mission. "We'll handle this," Collins said firmly. "But remember, they're trying to scare you into backing down." James's resolve only hardened. He knew that he couldn't allow fear to dictate his actions. The threats were a reminder of the stakes, but they also reinforced his commitment to justice. With the coalition's backing and the support of various organizations, James prepared to take his case to Congress. It was a monumental step, one that required extensive preparation. He spent weeks working with Malcolm, Dr. Karen Monroe, and other advocates, drafting a speech that captured the urgency of reform. On the day of his testimony, James entered the packed congressional chamber, aware of the importance of the moment. As he sat before the committee, he felt the weight of every story, every experience shared with him. This wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of countless individuals who had faced similar injustices. "Members of Congress, I stand before you not only as a military officer, but as a citizen who believes in the values of justice and equality," he began, his voice steady. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It reflects a pattern that undermines trust in our institutions. I urge you to consider reforms that will ensure accountability and protect the rights of all citizens." The room was silent as he spoke, his words resonating deeply. When he finished, several members expressed their support, promising to prioritize his proposals. As James left the chamber, he felt a surge of hope. This was a step toward lasting change, a turning point in his journey. After his congressional testimony, James became a prominent figure in the national conversation around law enforcement reform. But the recognition came with a cost. He and his family could no longer go about their daily lives without noticing whispers, stares, and sometimes even open hostility from strangers. Cynthia felt the tension acutely. Errands that once took minutes now took hours, and her circle of friends had shrunk to those who unwaveringly supported their family. She noticed the wary glances, the casual avoidance from parents at her children's school events. It hurt, but she maintained a strong front for James and their children. One evening, as they sat together after putting the kids to bed, Cynthia voiced her concerns. "James, this attention is tearing our lives apart. I support what you're doing, but I worry about the toll it's taking on the kids. Grace's friends won't even come over anymore." James reached for her hand, his heart heavy. "I never wanted this for us," he said quietly. "But I don't know if I can stop now. Too many people are depending on this movement." Cynthia looked at him, her gaze filled with love and worry. "Just promise me you'll stay safe. Whatever happens, don't let this consume you." He nodded, though he knew the journey had already changed them all irrevocably. For every step forward, there seemed to be an equal setback. While James struggled with the pressures of public life, Officer Mike Randall continued his quiet path of redemption. Working closely with the community center, he began organizing small forums where officers and residents could discuss their experiences and concerns openly. It was a difficult process, marked by raw emotions and challenging questions, but Randall felt a deep sense of responsibility to rebuild trust. One day, during a forum, a young man named Marcus shared his story of being racially profiled multiple times while walking home from his after-school job. His voice shook with frustration and sadness, recounting the embarrassment and anger he felt each time he was stopped without reason. Randall listened, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. When Marcus finished, Randall stood up, addressing the room. "I can't undo the wrongs I've done," he began, his voice steady but pained. "But I'm here because I want to learn and be part of the change. I'm working on myself and the system that allowed me to act on biases I didn't even recognize." The room was silent as Randall spoke, and when he finished, Marcus approached him, his expression a mix of caution and hope. "I just want things to change," Marcus said quietly. Randall nodded. "So do I." In that moment, Randall felt the weight of his journey, but he also felt something else: purpose. He knew he would dedicate himself to helping bridge the divide, however long it took. The day after Randall's forum, James received an unsettling call from FBI agent Brian Collins. Collins informed him that a group known as the Purists, an extremist faction with ties to law enforcement opposition, had taken an interest in his work and had issued a direct threat against him. "James, they're organized and well-funded. They see you as a threat to their ideals, and they won't stop until they feel they've silenced you," Collins warned. James's stomach tightened as he processed the information. He had anticipated resistance, but he hadn't fully understood the lengths to which some would go to stop him. Collins assured him that the FBI was increasing security measures around his family and home. Despite the precautions, the reality of the danger weighed heavily on James. That night, he told Cynthia about the threats, and she looked at him with an expression of quiet fear. "Is there any way to step back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For us, for the kids?" James took her hand, his gaze steady. "I understand if you're scared, but stepping back now would mean everything we've done so far was for nothing. I can't let fear be the end of this." Cynthia nodded, but the fear lingered in her eyes. They held each other in silence, each silently preparing for the unknown dangers that lay ahead. As public support for James grew, so did opposition from those determined to undermine his mission. The smear campaign against him intensified, with news outlets publishing unsubstantiated rumors about his military service and questioning his loyalty to law enforcement. Social media flooded with inflammatory comments, and James became the target of a new wave of harassment. One particularly hurtful rumor suggested that James was profiting from the campaign for reform. Accusations of cashing in on the fight for justice filled comment sections, casting a shadow over his integrity. James knew he had to address these claims directly. He scheduled another press conference, standing before the cameras with a determined expression. "These attacks are not about the truth. They're about fear. Fear of change, fear of accountability, and fear of justice," he stated firmly. "My service record is a matter of public record. I have served this country with honor, and I am not profiting from this fight. This movement is about creating a fair system, one that serves all Americans equally." His words struck a chord with many, and supporters rallied around him, pushing back against the false narratives. Veterans and civil rights leaders publicly defended his integrity, and the smear campaign gradually lost traction. However, the emotional toll remained. That evening, James reflected on how public perception could shift so easily, how people could question a lifetime of dedication in an instant. Amidst the increasing challenges, the Edwards family found strength in each other. Grace and Ethan, though deeply affected by the situation, began to see their father's actions with newfound respect. They became vocal advocates in their school, educating their classmates on the importance of fairness and accountability. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Grace shared a story about standing up to a friend who had dismissed her father's work. "I told them that Dad's not against the police. He's against unfair treatment. And if they can't see the difference, that's their problem," Grace said, her eyes fierce with determination. James felt a surge of pride. His children were learning the value of courage, the importance of standing up for what they believed in. He realized that, despite the challenges, his family was growing stronger, more resilient, and more united. With the reform bill gaining national support, James prepared for a crucial meeting with key lawmakers to finalize the proposals. The coalition's work had laid a strong foundation, but they knew that persuading Congress would be a challenge. In the days leading up to the meeting, James, Malcolm, and Dr. Karen Monroe spent countless hours refining their arguments, anticipating objections, and gathering testimonials from citizens impacted by systemic bias. The meeting itself was tense. Some lawmakers voiced concerns about the potential backlash from police unions, while others questioned the feasibility of the proposals. But James spoke with conviction, drawing on both his personal experience and the experiences of countless others who had faced injustice. We have a duty to protect the rights of all citizens, to build a system that serves and respects everyone, he argued passionately. These reforms aren't about punishing officers. They're about ensuring that every American can trust the people sworn to protect them. The room fell silent as he spoke, and gradually, he saw nods of agreement. By the end of the meeting, several lawmakers expressed their support, pledging to back the bill. James felt a surge of hope. This was the closest they had come to real, lasting change. The victory in Congress was short-lived. Late one evening, James received an urgent call from Agent Collins. "James, we have intel suggesting that the Purists are planning an attack. We're increasing security around your home, but we need you to be vigilant," Collins warned. James relayed the information to Cynthia, and they gathered the children, instructing them to stay away from the windows and avoid going outside alone. Around midnight, they heard a loud crash outside. A car screeched to a stop in front of their house, and figures emerged, throwing objects that exploded into bursts of smoke. James and Cynthia ushered the children into the safe room they had installed, huddling together as the commotion continued outside. When the smoke cleared, they saw that the perpetrators had fled, leaving behind threatening graffiti painted across their front lawn. James reported the incident to Collins, who assured him that the FBI was taking every precaution. But the message was clear. The threats were real, and they were escalating. A few nights later, as James returned from a meeting, he noticed a black SUV following him. He tried to ignore it, but as he approached his neighborhood, the SUV pulled up beside him. A masked figure rolled down the window, pointing directly at him. "You think you can change the system?" The figure sneered. "Think again." The SUV sped off before James could react, leaving him shaken. He drove home cautiously, feeling the weight of the threat pressing down on him. This was no longer about mere opposition. This was a personal attack, a direct attempt to intimidate him. When he told Cynthia, her face grew pale with fear. But as she held his hand, she looked him in the eye. "They're trying to scare you because they know you're making a difference. Don't let them win." Her words steadied him, and he resolved to continue, even in the face of escalating danger. News of the attack spread quickly, and community members rallied around the Edwards family. People brought flowers, cards, and messages of support, creating a protective circle around their home. Local churches organized vigils, and community leaders publicly denounced the threats. One evening, a group of veterans visited James, standing with him on his front lawn. "We're here for you, Colonel," one of them said. "We've fought for this country, and we're not about to let anyone scare you away from doing the right thing." The support strengthened James's resolve. He realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had a community of allies who believed in his mission. As the reform bill neared a critical vote, James received another warning from Collins. The FBI had intercepted communications indicating that the Purists were planning a major assault to coincide with the vote, hoping to intimidate him into silence. That night, James gathered his family, ensuring they understood the safety protocols. Just before midnight, he heard the low rumble of approaching vehicles. Security agents positioned around the house sprang into action as masked figures attempted to storm the property. James held his family close in the safe room as gunshots echoed outside. The FBI agents responded quickly, subduing the attackers before they could reach the house. When the chaos subsided, James emerged to find his yard littered with evidence of the assault. Agent Collins approached him, his expression grave but resolute. "We got them, James. They won't bother you again." James nodded, his heart pounding with relief and exhaustion. The ordeal had taken its toll, but he knew they had reached a turning point. In the days following the assault, James and his family relocated to a secure, undisclosed location while the FBI completed its investigation. The emotional toll weighed heavily on them all. Grace and Ethan struggled with nightmares, reliving the night's terror. Cynthia, though outwardly strong, was visibly shaken, her protective instincts on high alert. James tried to be the rock his family needed, but he too felt the trauma. Even simple sounds, a car engine, a creak in the floorboards, would startle him, his pulse quickening involuntarily. The realization that his fight for justice had nearly cost his family their lives filled him with guilt, and he found himself questioning if it had all been worth it. But then, on a quiet afternoon, James received a letter from a young man named Darius, a college student who had followed his story closely. "Colonel Edwards, I want you to know that your courage inspired me. You've given people like me a reason to hope for a fairer world. Because of you, I'm studying criminal justice, so I can make a difference. Thank you for showing us that change is possible." James read the letter in silence, feeling the weight of Darius's words. It was a reminder that the fight had never been just about him. It was about the future he was building for people like Darius, for his children, and for the countless others who deserved a better world. As the FBI apprehended the leaders of the Purist group, news of the attack spread nationwide, sparking widespread outrage. People from across the country rallied in solidarity with James, holding marches, vigils, and public discussions on the importance of police reform. It became clear that James's ordeal had become a turning point, energizing citizens to demand accountability and justice. With his family's support, James returned to the public eye. He resumed his work with the coalition, pushing for the passage of the police reform bill that had now garnered bipartisan support. His story became a symbol of resilience, reminding lawmakers and citizens alike of the importance of justice and fairness. One morning, as he prepared for a televised interview, Cynthia joined him, adjusting his tie with a gentle smile. "No matter what happens today, I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. James felt a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he replied, holding her hand. The interview was watched by millions. James spoke with clarity and conviction, recounting the challenges he had faced and reiterating his commitment to building a fairer system. He acknowledged the support of his family, his allies, and the countless Americans who had stood with him. "We're at a pivotal moment in history," he concluded, his voice resonating through the screen. "Let's build a future where justice and dignity are rights afforded to everyone, not privileges reserved for a few." In the aftermath of the attack, the community rallied together, organizing meetings and events to foster understanding between citizens and law enforcement. Officer Randall, who had continued his path of redemption, became a crucial figure in these efforts, using his experience to facilitate open dialogues. Randall arranged a community forum where residents could speak candidly with local officers about their concerns and experiences. He invited James to attend as a guest speaker, and though the memories of the attack were still fresh, James agreed, understanding the importance of unity and healing. Standing before the crowd, James spoke about his journey, the hardships he'd endured, and his vision for a future rooted in understanding and trust. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But when we commit to listening to each other, to learning from our mistakes, and to building bridges instead of walls, we move closer to a society we can all be proud of." The event concluded with a standing ovation, and as James and Randall exchanged a respectful nod, both men knew they had come a long way. Their journeys had intersected in ways neither could have predicted, but both had found purpose in making amends and building a better future. As the reform bill neared a vote, James's story inspired a nationwide movement. Citizens organized rallies and marches in major cities, holding banners with messages of support and unity. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #ChangeTheSystem, amplifying James's message. James traveled to Washington, D.C. to witness the bill's introduction in Congress. He was joined by other advocates, community leaders, and citizens who had come to show their support. The atmosphere was charged with hope and anticipation. The bill was debated fiercely, with some lawmakers expressing concern over the potential backlash from police unions, while others highlighted the importance of accountability and trust. Throughout it all, James sat quietly in the gallery, his heart pounding as he listened to each argument. Finally, the vote was called. As the tally was read, a wave of emotion swept over James. The bill had passed, and with it, a new era of accountability and reform had begun. James felt tears prick his eyes as he looked out over the chamber, realizing the magnitude of what they had achieved. He thought of Darius, of his own children, of every person who had fought for justice and dignity, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. In the weeks that followed, James returned home, eager to reconnect with his family and begin the process of healing. Life slowly settled into a new normal, with the Edwards family finding solace in simple routines and moments of quiet joy. One afternoon, Grace approached him, a notebook in her hands. "Dad, I want to write about everything that's happened, about you and everything you went through. I want people to remember." James smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "That's a beautiful idea, Grace. People need to know the truth, and your words will help keep that truth alive." Grace began her project with dedication, interviewing her father and others involved in the movement. Her words captured the story with honesty and compassion, becoming a reminder of the sacrifices made and the victories won. Meanwhile, Officer Randall continued his outreach work, helping to organize workshops on bias training and community policing. His efforts contributed to a gradual shift in public perception, with more people beginning to view law enforcement as allies rather than adversaries. James watched these developments with a sense of hope, knowing that the seeds of change were beginning to take root. Months later, James was invited to speak at a unity summit held at the National Mall, attended by leaders, activists, and citizens committed to promoting equality and justice. As he stood before the vast crowd, he felt the weight of his journey, the hardships he'd endured, and the victories he'd achieved. "This movement isn't about one person," he began, his voice steady and strong. "It's about a collective commitment to justice, accountability, and the belief that every individual deserves to be treated with dignity." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze unwavering. "Let this be our legacy, that we fought for a future where justice isn't just a word, but a reality, where unity, compassion, and fairness guide our actions. Together, we can build a world worthy of our children and future generations." As he finished, the crowd rose in a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the air. James felt a sense of peace, knowing that his journey had made a difference, that his fight had laid the foundation for a better world. Years passed, and the Edwards family continued to heal, their lives intertwined with the legacy James had created. Grace's project became a published book, a chronicle of her father's journey and the movement he inspired. Ethan went on to study political science, inspired by his father's dedication to justice. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Grace shared a story from a recent book signing event. "People kept coming up to me, thanking me for telling our story," she said, her eyes shining. "They said it gave them hope." James smiled, his heart full. Hope is what keeps us moving forward. And as long as we have that, we're unstoppable. Cynthia reached for his hand, her gaze filled with love and pride. "You've changed lives, James." "We all have." In that moment, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His journey had been filled with challenges, but he had endured, inspired others, and created a legacy that would live on for generations. The Edwards family had found healing, and together, they looked forward to a future filled with hope, justice, and unity. Thank you for watching this story of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. If you found it inspiring and want to see more stories that explore the human spirit and drive for change, Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new uploads. Join us on this journey and be part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to make a difference. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us share these important messages with more people. So if you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with friends and family. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next story.